So I'm very pleased to welcome you back to this third panel. Let me introduce the panelists. The panelists are invited already to move on to these much more comfortable armchairs we have here. So please come up to on stage. First, Michael Halling in green. Green finance, green sweater, perfect. Since 2021, he has been professor and has the chair for sustainable finance at the University of Luxembourg. He's been a professor for a long time, but since 21, professor at the University of Luxembourg. He has not one, but two PhD, one in computer science and one in finance of TU Vienna. Then during his academic career, he spent 5 years at the University of Utah and 9 years at the Stockholm School of Economics. Michael's research concentrates on sustainable finance, sustainable asset pricing, and asset management and cycles of capital. I think in English it sounds much better. His work was published in magazines like Finance. Christina Ehlert is head of the program on the strengthening of the value chains in agriculture and forestry at ADA Microfinance, an NGO in Luxembourg with a global reach. 15 years professional experience. Christina develops solutions to promote sustainable development through research in agriculture and environment, and developed environmental policy and sustainability policies. He has a doctorate in plants ecophysiology of Montpellier, France, and a tri-national master in biology of the Oberrhein University of France, Germany, and Switzerland. So she can speak all three languages probably. And since 2020, Christina has been a member of the Conseil Supérieur for Sustainable Development, Higher Council for Sustainable Development. Rudi Belli, sitting next to Michael, is Senior Vice President, Head of Department, and Secretary General of Spuerkeess, the savings bank here in Luxembourg. In 2019, he is responsible for the coordination in sustainable finance. One of his main tasks is the implementation of IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, at the Spuerkeess, the savings bank. And the savings bank, the Spuerkeess, has a scientific advisory board. Not many banks have a scientific advisory board, and also an alternative savings bank in cooperation with ETICAP. Fabian Söffge is partner at Argos Wityu in Munich. He has studied in Munich, then he worked for PwC for private equity customers, and since 2016 he's joined Argos Wityu. In his work, Fabian Söffge tries to create values for all stakeholders and always focuses on sustainability, decarbonation, and ESG. Thank you very much for joining us here on this panel. I'd like to thank you for holding out for so long in the room. This will be short and sweet, and will not take longer than promised. So once again, an overview this morning. We talked about the macro level, then the climate panel. We talked about biodiversity too, and now we're talking about the implementation and practice. We can say that's the most important panel today. I would say we have four big questions. First, where do we stand with sustainable business models or activities? To promote that via financial conditions, positive financial. What are the traps? What are the pros and cons? Thirdly, what are the business models that function in the logic of the taxonomy and classical bank financing? And fourthly, what other forms of financing are needed on top of that in Europe and across the world? Let me start with Mr. Belli. The taxonomy is not necessarily fit for practice. One example are the 700 do not significant harm criteria of the taxonomy, or this monster Excel of the European Commission. So how does your bank handle these regulatory requirements of the green finance agenda, particularly the taxonomy of the EU? And my second question, you probably have green or sustainable projects which, however, cannot be covered by the taxonomy, do you finance them nevertheless if it's financially feasible?
Mikro bitte nehmen wegen.
Microphone, please, for our interpreter's sake. Can you hear me? So, yes, regulatory aspects are quite a challenge. You can say this here. Problem is also that we have such a diversity of rules and regulations, and all the efforts needed to get this covers and complexity also. And this is quite new for the banks as well, we have to say. So this has nothing to do with financial aspects. It's rather a non-financial problem area, if I may say so. And I would like to show a few paths we have chosen here quite concretely, not talking about rules and regulations at this time. So we've have priority themes for our work. Number one being climate. 46% of our assets are climate relevant, which is normal. Then immediately central bank. We're a systemic bank. We have the stress test implemented as well. Quite a good result, by the way. But now we have to say this is a method that has been applied here that is rather general than the European Banking Authority. Pillar 3 risks have been published, and this again is something it's quite complicated again. With data it's always the same, but you should not hide behind the data. It's important as well to, well, if the data are not available, to have alternative methodologies. Quoting this area, the PCAF methodology for CO2, which I thought was quite interesting, and amongst the banks, it's actually used by most of the banks. Interesting here is when you do not have data on company level, then you have averages, national average values on a sectoral level that you can use. So, like I said, you should not hide behind the absence of data in a way. Important as well for us, National Banking Alliance, and we're Net Zero Banking Alliance. Remember there as well, and I will talk to you about this a little bit afterwards. Another topic coming up in our scientific advisory board is biodiversity. So I know this is extremely complicated, but central bank is also quite pushing the banks to get started with biodiversity and human rights also. We have a roadmap with the CS3D worked out, but we're still in the initial phase here. So linked to complexity, we're having integration of science. A scientific advisory board has been constituted in the first 2 years. We've been discussing about climate risks, and the scientific advisory board is working for the banks. Net zero, when we have determined the small targets, with the scientific advisory board, we've been looking for advice here to see whether it's okay, and it's important that these experts are being asked for advice. The same for floods. With this, we have developed a plan where more specific flooding maps have been developed with lists that can be used on a national level as well. We are using them to have a damage function to be determined for our activity in the mortgage loan area. And this should be developed with other banks as well, that flooding maps can be used in a broader way. Then sectoral transition risks with ESA. With ESA, we are trying to have transition risks determined as well. Sectoral transitional risks. We have 3 sectors where we're focusing these efforts on. It's construction, it's transport, and the third sector is tourism. And we're trying here to have the value chain or the supply chain indicated, allowing us a more in-depth analysis to see where transitional risks might show up. This is quite interesting in the cooperation with LISA. Quite complicated when you work with science. On an organizational level, the project and the climate area is on a central guidance level, including different departments when needed. And risk management, an impact on risk management. Our risk management is developing towards more competence here as well. But we are also having a look at a new dimension that will be playing a major role in the future as well when developing strategies and zero banking. So we are determining targets for this performance management here. Performance management giving us an indication what these measures mean for business. So it's the other way around, if you like. Then taxonomy, that was the second question, and I think I've been extending my speaking time already, but please allow me one more remark. We have sectoral exclusion procedures. Certain sectors significant harm in our view. We're excluding them. And then we have ESG controversies where, for instance, infringements against UN rules where certain companies are excluded again. Having not respected these rules. Data situation is quite good for securities, bonds, equities, but data situation is rather in existence for credits. So for loans. So we have to come together here. It makes sense that banks do not get active here individually, but that's still another problem. But what we see as green project finance in our title, well, this leads me to a concept that the director of the IAB just mentioned, significant contributions. So we are using a tool named the EIB Green Checker, and different project finance aspects are being analyzed according to the significant contribution value. And if according to significant contribution this is considered as being positive, well, better financial conditions will be granted. That's how I would describe the situation. Taxonomy right now is not to be used at 100%. We're using part of it, and I think right now this is the only way to try and treat this topic. Okay, thank you very much. Next topic for Mr. Söffge, private equity company. You're an essential part of the funding landscape and complementing the banking function. So you're working in Europe mostly, representation in Benelux, France, Germany, and Italy. Can you give us a few impressions from the financing daily business of sustainable financing activities in these EU countries with us? Well, certainly. Good afternoon, first of all, and an office in Luxembourg as well. Benelux, there's Belgium, but there's Luxembourg as well, of course. We should differentiate. We do private equity, what we don't do, and today, in the course of the day, it's mentioned no venture capital, no green tech, and no infrastructure projects in the sense of offshore wind parks. No, we are doing normal companies, if I may say so. Former saxophone supplier, former rail company. So this is an area where the green finance in the classic definition is not excluded, but not really present either. So what can we observe in our daily business? We can see that all are focused on the enablers, our competitors here, companies, service providers, and products being proposed here that will reduce the clients' emissions. crazy prices are being paid here, and actually financing banks are involved. But this is not the big part of the economy here. When we're talking about funding the SMEs or the middle class, we're not thinking of the most companies having the most employees and the biggest contribution to the GDP. And how can these players become more green? How can I support them in their integration process? Concerning daily business, when we do have companies that are being sold and contributing in the green sense, in the sense of sustainability, well, acquisition funding banks are willing as well to be very flexible. We can see now more and more margin grids, loan contracts when certain KPIs are being reached are improved from year to year. Less margin on the Euribor will be paid. A lot is being done here, and ESG is being mentioned by everyone. And Professor Schulz, a lot of greenwashing is unfortunately being done there as well. We have a lot of actors interpreting the rules and regulations in a way that on paper it's okay, but the contribution is not really significant. I would have a follow-up question for you immediately here. With your employer, you have a climate action fund, and you try to make sure the transformation of grey or brown company activities become greener and support and accompany this process. So my question is, how do you observe the willingness to go consequently towards more sustainability on the company side and on the investor side alike? Well, here, just to give you an idea, without launching some advertisement here, I would like to say that we've seen a lot of actors on market level where it's not clear what strategy they're developing. We have an Article 9 DSCR at the about 9.3 actually. Transformation of grey to green is the topic here, with one hard objective, 7.5% CO2 reduction per company per year. Completely Paris aligned, the only KPI indicator that is really proven. How will you measure biodiversity? Maybe we can do so in 5 years in the second generation of the fund, hopefully. But again, one transparent hard target here you can measure already is the one that I just took up. Concerning a question with the companies, this is quite interesting because the discussions we're having, we have to separate it to two groups here. We have the old patriarch where children are doing something completely different. They do not want to take on the company. They've lived through a crisis and they don't really care. And then you have the young generation in the management level as well, not only entrepreneurs. They are completely eager. They know that if in the area of sustainability I don't get active, I will not find co-workers on the market. That's how it goes when in your fight for talents. And on the investor side, you see the same dynamics for the well-off individuals, family offices, for big institutional capital collecting assets like insurance companies and banks. This is not completely integrated into the strategy, but it's getting better and better. You have budgets that are decidedly after Article 8 or 9 products. Also, when you go to Scandinavia, most of the investors have given themselves the rule to only invest in this nothing dirty or nothing grey any longer. Clear trend in the last 24 months, a crazy development in this area. Other question for all panelists, it has been mentioned the second time already, looking for talents, for expertise. Christian Schulz mentioned it also in his keynote. How about maybe on the Spuerkeess or in companies in general in the area of recruitment to have real financial or sustainable finance experts? Maybe Michael Harden can tell us how they are producing these experts in a way. Use your mic, please. Well, actually, we are working with the University of Luxembourg when we talk about ESG competence to be developed in the University of Luxembourg as well. And that these people would be hired in our company. So this has to be seen with the Scientific Advisory Board, cooperative approach. We have 3 young talents in the area of ESG in direct contact with scientists and experts. And this is supposed to enrich them as well, allowing them to learn new aspects, not only the perspective of finance, but also the impact and the whole problem of science and scientific development in this area. It is important to have all these aspects coming together. Well, it's my turn. Thank you for the invitation, first of all. Thank you for the question. It's a good question for someone coming from the university, precisely. But one point has to be underlined here. It has been mentioned in the course of the day several times, by the way. Sustainable finance is interdisciplinary. Different thematic areas are coming together. Finance, obviously, as part of the concept, but also sustainability in the environmental area, social area, technical, rules and regulations. A lot of different areas are coming together here. And as mentioned before, this makes things extremely complex, of course. You can see there's a lot of demand here by nature to have well-skilled staff. Different challenges have to be mastered on the market level. It has been mentioned also beforehand, briefly. Nicholas from SFI was here in the panel. There's a working group specifically involved here in the development of an overview concerning all those who propose education in the area of sustainability in Luxembourg. It's a great initiative to see what the different offers are here, what are the advantages, are the disadvantages, the specifics of these offers. On the university side, of course, we also try to be active in this field on all levels. For instance, in our Master of Science and Economics, we have a specific track in the area of sustainable finance. About 20 students per year are following this course. We had a lot of demand on the market level as well, with internships and longer-term engagements in Luxembourg. We propose a certification as well, where people who are working already can try and develop more expertise in the area of sustainability. For instance, we have an 8-day training to give a first perspective. And in these programs, we try to have a representation of the diversity of the challenges. We are taking up people as well who are teachers themselves, natural science aspects, rules and regulations, disclosure and accounting and transparency, but also from the financial sector, obviously. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of dynamics have been developed at the market level, and there's certain purification aspects in the course offers to filter through all those who are proposing trainings that are not really at the right level. But a lot of things is going on, and it's about reskilling also of financial experts being present here. And we have a few university students amongst our audience, so during the break you can give us some job offers as well, so they might be interested. So Christina, Ehlert, question for you. In your daily work, you're focusing on making funding availability for economic activities in the agriculture and forestry areas in countries of the global south. What can you tell us about the influence on green financing infrastructures on your work? You are certainly trying to have sustainable economic activities developed, but sustainable also in the sense of the taxonomy for the funding, but that might pose some challenges for you as well. How's this working for you? Thank you, first of all, for your kind invitation to this event. Maybe I might indicate initially what ADA does. We have changed perspective in this last panel here. ADA is supporting microfinancing institutions in developing countries, always working in partnership with organizations. And the scope has been extended a little bit, but we might talk about this later on, possibly. But it's really about having, in the areas of agriculture and forestry, one of the three strategic topics of ADA, microfinancing institutions involved in order to make sure that microfinancing services are being proposed, loans or insurance products to be developed. On the one hand, they would support sustainable activities. On the other hand, also allow to acquire sustainable equipment. What can be indicated here, for instance, for economic activities? So we're talking about buying seeds or more mechanic tools or hiring workers, and sustainable equipment, solar pumps or drying equipment for coffee, for instance, or also what else do we have? Solar-driven fridges or mini PV installations, typical financial services made possible through micro loans or micro financial services, allowing these to be acquired. There's a particular aspect as compared to European financial service providers. It's the fact that quite often the offer from financial service providers can also be coupled to non-financial services quite often. So the transition here, that's certainly a very interesting model, because the transition towards new types of equipment or new practical approaches in the agricultural field are always linked to learning efforts as well. And microfinance service providers also provide technical assistance to make sure that small farmers are supported in each and every way. Climate agricultural practice can be proposed here as well, allowing them to adapt. And then the small farmers, households, and companies have to be supported along the way as well in a technical sense. And then concerning one of the challenges here, for sure, we have seen that the European taxonomy is maybe not immediately implementable in practice, has to be adapted, but it proposes a framework nevertheless and indicates what's being really sustainable. In developing countries or for our partners as well, it's not always obvious to see, because it's quite complicated at times, and to see where we can get started with our financial services in order to support and extend sustainability. And it's also a matter of resilience of small farmers, adaptation to the needs of climate change. A certain framework makes sense here in our view, and if it's missing completely, well, you have no points to get started and no instruments to make sure that we can accompany the financial service providers. What we observe here actually is that these taxonomies are certainly also to be made available in developing countries. They have to be elaborated, for instance, in Bangladesh or in Asia in general. But on a national level, this has to be developed more precisely. And these initiatives as a whole are still in the initial phase. But there's certainly a first step also to make sure that financial service providers are really pushed to get started in these sustainability areas. And if I may add an explanation, it is really important to have further incentives to be created for financial service providers, and capacity building with the financial service providers is needed, especially in the area of agriculture. We are working together with partners in different countries in Western Africa, and we can see they have developed strategies concerning staff questions. In Europe, it's quite the same question. And partners in some of the countries in Western Africa are asking the same questions: in how far do we have to continue our own training concerning agricultural financing? And in that case, for instance, farmers have to be hired, and also agronomists. We have been talking about risk assessment quite a lot today already, and analysis of portfolios. And this question is coming up in the area of agriculture as well. What type of financing in development countries then? As we could see, red cards in the morning are to be seen where, well, yes, high risks are existing, and microfinance institutions will have to ask the question in how far our clients have to be accompanied towards other value chains, to invest in other systems also. And the first question is the risk analysis, and then the development of strategies as a second step. One example We have different types of reactions from microfinance institutions according to the level in which climate impacts had already been observed. For instance, we have one institution in Latin America. They had developed a risk analysis on a portfolio level, and they had the possibility to insure their portfolio against climate impacts, but they didn't do it because the cost-benefit analysis didn't allow them to make sure that this would really take place and that the costs were really needed. In a concrete example in Nicaragua, the microfinance institution, etc. Okay, let's see. Quite often we've seen certain events. Small farmers had incidents due to climate change impacts, and the portfolio had been insured at the end of the day. So we need some awareness building here for this need, especially with insurance companies. But the tendency, the trend is that this is higher and higher on the agenda because people realize that this is one of the mechanisms precisely. Of course, with an insurance, we don't have production, but at least on the side of the financial institution, we have a certain type of risk management anchored. And actually, ADA is also supporting in Senegal a program that was started this year with 6 microfinance institutions. We've actually developed agriculture insurance products that are integrated in our general offer of the financial service providers in a mandatory way or based on their own device, and it's facultative, and so they can develop their own setting, develop a program if needed, so mandatory or optional. Another element I wanted to mention in the area of microfinance is that we can certainly observe that the risk distribution is important between microfinance institutions and partners. For microfinance institutions, there should be more projects started in the area of sustainability and climate adaptations. In agriculture and forestry, there will be major steps. Instruments like private-public partnerships and also country supports. This will certainly be possible and certainly needed.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to hear what is going on abroad on the microfinance level. We see that in green finance, we end up in the development aid quite quickly. There's a lot of need for money. There are some areas where you can make money and other areas where you need to spend money. All this is very important. Michael, we know that Europe is bank-based. About 80% of the financing of economic activities is done by banks. Banks, as we know, are risk-averse and are a central element of our economy and a target of many regulation initiatives. Are we well equipped with this system to finance sustainable activities if the premise is it needs to be bankable? That's a very good question. I think we see in the distribution of the panel, you have a mix. We need a mix of sources of capital in general, but also for the transformation, for sustainable development. There are, of course, differences between the projects that the bank finances in normal cases, or venture capitalists, or private equity, or a private-public partnership. There are these differences. The role of banks, whether we're well placed with so many banks in Europe, so dependent on banks, is not so much of a problem, I think. I think banks are destined to make a large contribution to the transformation, perhaps less, as was discussed in previous panels, less to finance very innovative, risky technologies, but rather to finance the big transformation projects. Infrastructure was mentioned earlier on. support companies in the transformation from brown and grey to green. Some companies are solid, are robust, they have a certain size. These are projects that can be, I'd imagine, are bankable, but at the same time, in Europe we have many small and medium-sized enterprises, many SMEs. So it's not a surprise, it's not a coincidence that banks play such a great role in financing in Europe. So one important aspect you need to remember, as was mentioned earlier on, it's always pleasant to speak at the end of the day. You can refer to everything that has been said before, but it's always about the impact that we can measure, that changes have actually happened in the real economy, and that we're not simply talking in a bubble about investments and financial institutions. And particularly the discussion on impact, investments or engagement, so an interaction with companies. This is a big advantage for banks. I don't know if Rudi agrees with me, but I hope so, that banks have year-long relationships with their customers. Banks know their customers fairly well. There is a communication channel between the bank and the customers. This is something normal in a capital market.
Gedanken mache oder über standardisierte
and not loans which are bought by a number of investors. These communication channels, these possibilities do less exist. I think banks have a possibility to have an effect. At the same time, I see the flexibility. Credit contracts need to be adapted to make the right incentives. They're relatively flexible. If I have a bond or a share, I need to adapt a bond or a share. It needs to be homogeneous. It needs to fit into the regulations. It's less flexible. And for all these reasons, I must admit that I see banks can play a central role positively, that they have the right setup and the right conditions to play an important role in the transformation. I would like to give the floor to Rudi right away. Of course, banks play an important role, particularly in the transformation in the infrastructure sector, the building sector, which is a huge task to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This cannot be done without the banks. So what does the green asset ratio play? How will it influence the granting of credit in the future? With the microphone, please, Rudi. It's true. Banks have a great role to play in the transition, also for small and medium-sized enterprises. What we also try, together with other partners, is that we take stock of the ERT performance, the current state of affairs in SMEs, and from there, you can accompany the transition and finance it and see where things can be improved. Coming to the asset ratio, so it's easy to explain the percentage of sustainable assets in a bank balance according to the rules of taxonomy. If I may express it that way. Across the world, I think in the real economy, there are 1 to 2% estimated. For banks, on average, if you take balances, even if you cannot do the calculations 100%, there are too many data missing, but we estimate 5 to 6% with banks. This is the reality. And the green asset ratio, as it is defined today, we have a problem with the data. We're in the starting blocks. Many companies do not report according to the CSRD. And on the other hand, the small and medium-sized companies I just talked about, they are not part of the perimeter of the scope, maybe in 2027. And this is where we need the transition, exactly there. Of course, mortgage credits are included. Now, the future of the green asset ratio In 3-4 years' time, this will be an element, fixed element. Taxonomy will be the only definition of sustainability. That's clear. That's absolutely clear. And this will be a green liquidity ratio, or creditworthiness ratio, rather. And it's an important element in defining prices. It's clear that the taxonomy, rating the taxonomy will have an influence on the creditworthiness of a company. It's part of the whole system that is being built now. And I also wanted to add that where taxonomy, to be taxonomy aligned 100%, that's only that's the sustainability-linked financing. We can never be 100% aligned with the taxonomy by giving incentives. For instance, this is your situation, and if you do this or that, if you improve, then you get a reward in 3 years' time. These are the tools that we need to work with to improve the taxonomy and accompany and finance the transition. You mentioned CSRD and small and medium-sized corporate sustainability reporting directive. There will be an event in the House of Sustainability here in Luxembourg next month. So, information event for these companies which don't really know what is coming, while the savings bank are waiting for this data urgently. So, my question to the whole panel, the green premium, the greenium, where do you meet this greenium in your work, and how will conditions evolve because of regulation? Can we even talk about the greenium? Yes, briefly, to what you mentioned there is a very important point to the previous question. The EU Commission 2022 survey, 62% of all emissions in Europe come from the small and medium-sized companies, and 75% of these companies have no plan at all to decarbonize. So if I interpret the taxonomy very restrictively, and I couple this to your financing efforts, SFDR process, somewhere the capital access is missing from the small and medium-sized companies. This needs to be avoided, even if I agree with you that taxonomy is a good frame, but most of the company has no access to capital in that case. In that case, which brings me to the greenium, those companies which are already very sustainable today can get a better get better prices on the market, and those few existing companies are fighting, which produces absurd prices. And in 3, 4, 5 years' time, if I already deal with this as an SME, how can it become greener? Then I will belong to a small asset class and also achieve a greenium. And many competitors will disappear who have been dealing with this too late for lack of resources, for lack of management capacities, etc. So that's my assessment. So greeniums, we could spend a whole day talking on greeniums. This is a classical question, also academically in the financial sector, green premiums. What I'd like to say about this, the lady online in the previous panel from an NGO, she said that climate risks are not priced in. I do not agree with her. There are a number of academic studies showing that climate risks are indeed priced in the equity market or share market. I'll come to the green premium later on, that prices are sensitive to climate risks or are dependent on climate risks. And we also see in recent years on the greenium, how do you define a green premium? My definition of a greenium from an economic literature is that it's green companies achieve higher returns than others, and we've seen that in recent years. And exactly as my colleague just said, the explanation of the science is that this demand for green investment has increased so strongly that the market has been surprised by this explosion in demand, and you have achieved that some absurd prices are paid for some green assets. But in the medium and long term, I must say very clearly that on the side of the academic science, the way we talk about returns and prices in markets, we need to say that green assets in the long term should have lower returns than brown assets because they're less risky. They're not exposed to transitional risks as compared to brown assets. And on the other hand, because the idea is that investors also need to have some certain preferences for green assets to support this green transformation. So sustainable investors who have these preferences, and this idea of preferences that investors invest in sustainable assets because they generate a benefit, this is a central point for the long-term transformation and on how we invest, because if investors do have these preferences, and that's an important if, then they are also ready to forego certain returns, financial returns, or accept lower financial returns because they generate a benefit by the fact that they're saving the world. If that's not the case, then there will be a bad surprise, and we see to what extent the investments go in the other direction. It's a trend. It's not so far away because in the United States, currently we see some very intensive discussions on exactly premiums and to what extent green investing is in the interest of investors, whether it should be done or not. There are some states where state pension funds are told not to, explicitly not to invest along to sustainability criteria because you would forego financial performance, some financial performance. So this aspect of the gremium, from a point of view of the investors, is a very core point for the long-term transformation. I think all of us here in this room are among those who do want to have more green investments, impact investment, and I hope we remember this message also going back to our workplace. Another question to all of you here, the whole panel: what other forms of financing are needed beyond current forms of financing in Europe and in the world? Christina. What other forms of financing? When I think of our partnership with microfinance institutions, we certainly need financing for preferential conditions for certain activities, interest rates or repayment plans. Then we also need financing and refinancing lines for microfinance institutions which rely or which invest only in sustainable activities, so that we have specific envelopes for this that can be provided for this, that this financing exists. And then there needs to be facilitated access to climate and biodiversity financing sources. We always hear bankable or investable. It's still a problem also in our sector that some funds, the ticket size is not adjusted for the microfinance sector. But this is exactly where adjustment and mitigation solutions are necessary, as everywhere. And that the financing mechanisms need to be created, sources of finance need to be made available. But on the other hand, we don't want to go into a full grant system, but an economic financing model to a certain extent, I would say, remain in an economic financing model. And then payment for environmental services, we had a contribution from Nathalie Roth on the carbon credits or biodiversity credits, which will certainly exist soon, or co-benefits. These could also be financing mechanisms. I'd like to add very briefly, on the basis of this, Blended finance was mentioned several times today. This can certainly be extended so that you don't have this opposition between bankable, investable, scalability. You need to accept these things because banks, asset managers also operate under a number of conditions, framework conditions that they're obliged to operate in to be viable, to remain viable, and to be able to operate. And in these situations, it's important to find systems where you can combine public funding and private funding in such a way that it's not a grand scheme. So I agree with you about the sort of cooperation where risks are being shared or pooled by using tranching, seniority. These are concepts that exist, have been existed in the financial sector for 20, 30 years. Then you got the global crisis, financial crisis, and it was no longer so popular. But if this is done correctly, and if the risk systems are well done, we can finance more projects which perhaps currently are being excluded, and can generate more financing for these projects. Can we expect that these impulses can only come from the private sector, that it's possible without blended finance? So it's exactly about the preference, so that the demand for these products exists. I'm a bit disappointed that we do not have more innovation on the capital markets. There is a sustainability bond, green bonds, social bonds. So there is a certain dynamic there, but the introduction of the ETFs, how this has revolutionized capital markets. So 20, 40 years ago, we talked about passive investment. So, but there was no medium for that, and then the medium arrived, and today we say that 40–50% of the assets are invested passively. This causes a number of problems in terms of sustainability, but there was innovation that really solved the problem fundamentally, large scale. So unfortunately, I don't have the right idea, but this is a bit missing in the field of sustainability, a similar thrust, a leap forward. So these passives, they miss in the shareholder meetings, and the engagement is gone. But I hope this innovation will also come to our sector. I'd like to mention venture capital briefly. How do you see this in Europe? Is this a lever in Europe for transformation to achieve net zero, or are we not ready for this? Because, well, to achieve transformation in that respect. So that's not really my hobby horse, venture capital. Mr. Halling? I don't have any statistics in mind, but I think coming back to your first question on bank orientation in Europe or bank dependency in Europe, if you look at the whole European area, venture capital, angel financing, seed financing, high-risk financing is certainly not as well developed as it should or could. There is certainly room for development. I lived in Sweden for a long time, and there this is fairly well developed. Also in the United Kingdom until a short while ago. Continental Europe is still has a potential. It's also a very specific type of risk, because as a venture capitalist, the rule of thumb, you support 100 projects and one of them is successful. This is a highly risky venture or investment setup, and the question is whether it would be so perfect for transformation and sustainability aspects. Of course, there are some other aspects that need to be taken into account. If it's 1 out of 100, is that really quick enough to do the transformation? So that, and it adds to the complexity. So let me open the round of questions to all of you here in the room, to the public. Are there any questions you would like to ask the panel? Thank you. I have a question to Mrs. Ehlert. Microfinance is also seen very critically with horrendous interest rates, dependencies. What would you do in your work with impact measurement measures? Yes, that's over-indebtedness, for instance. I think there are a number of ways to tackle this. We have working groups, international working groups where this is being tackled. In our corporation, the question is microfinance, what for? And ADA has redefined this, and we've taken a step forward. We're asking ourselves, why do we do microfinance? ADA was founded in 1994. What have we learned in that time from microfinancing? What works and what doesn't? And this combination between financial service and non-financial services, financial education, financial literacy, these are topics that could help. And these are necessary measures. We need to support our clients. ADA has defined three strategic topics where microfinance is to be supported over the next 4 years. That's agriculture and forestry, because forestry is a new project, a new strategic topic where financing instruments need to be created over a longer period of time as compared to the typical farm credits, which only run 8 to 10 months. For forestry, we need to cover a number of years, which is certainly a challenge. On the other hand, access to basic services, energy, training, education, clean water, and sanitary performance, and then young companies, young entrepreneurship. And by choosing these topics, we also try to say, look, specific microfinancing for specific purposes. Any other questions from the floor? Austria. Thank you for this very broad and strong panel in late afternoon. My question goes in a completely different direction. Taxonomy was mentioned quite a lot, very complex. It's not user-friendly yet. And at global level, there are many different countries working on their own taxonomy. How do you see the future of taxonomy at the end of the day? Will there be one global taxonomy, or will there be a multitude of taxonomy? Is that the will? And you can choose and pick the right taxonomy for your investment. That's a damn difficult question. So ideally, it would be that taxonomy, that we have the same taxonomy across the world, applied across the world. When I look at all the discussions that we've had and still will have political effects, this doesn't make the thing easier. We need this taxonomy. We really need it. I believe in the taxonomy. In 5 years' time, we'll have this taxonomy in Europe, and Europe will also influence other continents. I have no idea how America is going to do this or going to accept this, but that's the problem. That time and again, the effect management is always secondary in everything we do. And the mindset, and we need to have the intellectual honesty to say it's about saving the world, and we need one single definition. But the problem is simply, well, people are the problem. Sorry to say so. I cannot be more precise. Yes, we have another question from the floor. Thank you also from my side. I found this very interesting. Also, the gremium point, the green premium. I hear from Switzerland, small SMEs could have problems if they turn their businesses into cyclic business models. And if we listen to your arguments for the green premium, one could have, well, they shouldn't have any problems in financing this. Do you have any experience in this respect in terms of business models which are fit for the circular economy? But I can buy some time from Mr. Söffge. I can buy some, if he wants to say something about this. The idea is, I think this is an important point because investors suppose that with green investments they can achieve higher in financial returns. The returns that an investor gets or the interests that a bank wants to on a credit, these are the financing costs of the company. So if I, as an investor, want to support a green company, then I need to be ready to sell my capital or make my capital available at lower costs. This is the way I support that company. The idea is that green companies are companies that contribute to the transformation, get capital at lower costs than companies that want to remain brown and don't want to transform. From an academic point of view, there are many studies that look at share markets, stock markets, and the evidence is mixed as to whether this is going to happen. But if you take credits or the costs for loans or bonds, then the empirical data that we use in science would say that green companies are companies that want to undergo this transformation very generally, not necessarily circular economy, but generally get access to capital at lower costs than brown companies. And in credit markets, in bond markets, this would show, because the question in the previous panel was how does green panel function? Are there any examples? These examples show that up to a certain point, this current trend is working because there is capital for green projects, green transformation projects. And this capital is being made available at lower rates, lower costs. Simply wanted to give you a specific example, and I'm also very interested in the academia, but I see it differently in practice. I get access to interesting capital for decarbonizations. For instance, we're looking at a company, they produce copper parts for a number of industries. You need copper in electric cars, electric vehicles, and wind turbines, so the demand is going to increase. Now I get a cheaper loan to move my production from gas to an electric furnace. From a gas furnace to electric, I reduce my footprint. On the other hand, I buy recycled copper, circular economy, and at the end of the day, I have a greener asset. Per 100 gram of copper, we have a lower CO2 footprint, and in my supplies, I get pressure from the supply chain, and I'm chosen, hopefully, and I win market share. That's the hypothesis. At the end of the day, if you want to sell, there is a scarcity of such companies, so there will probably be an over return, which to finance the furnace, to compensate for the new furnace, and I have a different OPEX basis, and I have less volatility in my management. So there are a number of approaches. I also understand the academic approach. Just to give you a specific real-life example. Why this should be a disadvantage in Switzerland, I cannot really understand. Rudi. Yes, I had a question to Michael. Very Ethika. Ethika is the concept of the saver forgoes part of his or her interest to finance a sustainable project at a lower interest rate. Is that in line with the definition of a greenium? Because I've heard this word for the very first time today, the green premium, the greenium. Would that be a concrete version of the greenium or not? So it's how you define the greenium, the green premium. But Fabian just, there is no official definition of a green premium, of a greenium, but in my definition of the greenium is that the green company is traded at a very high price. Rudi, your example would be the definition of a green project getting more favorable conditions for finance. The greenium in the economic literature is most for the other side. So the company, our green shares, a green company is valued at a higher value than others. The idea is not because it's more risky, but exactly as you described, because of the current scarcity or the high demand for such green companies, which is positive because it is an incentive for companies to become greener because they see that this demand exists and there is capital available for them. And there is some research work being done which tries to demonstrate to what extent the demand or the offer of green companies or supply of green companies is going to react to this excessive demand.
And I think, again, different types of approaches would be possible here to have companies involved in the early stage in the process, allowing them to become potential investees with a high value. We can see this in a program that ADA is coordinating in Luxembourg, actually, with 3 partners, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, involved in the cooperation here. Smallholder safety net upskilling program is the title, and we can see that new impact investors are actually partly entering into the competition, but there's actually a program for technical assistance for potential investees. They're being accompanied to become real investees. So, circular economy question once again. I think the worst data situation is similar as with biodiversity and climate for circular economy. It's much more difficult to measure. Objective in the taxonomy is not completely formulated either, and then it's more difficult to have a successful financing guaranteed when it's about circular economy or steel to be reused, but only in 20 years you will have the economy when you actually reuse this. That's the investment horizons we have, and it's not really possible to represent it. This is a difficult area, actually. Maybe next year we could have a more in-depth discussion about this. Circular finance, very well. Other questions? Maybe can understand if slowly but surely we're getting tired. Maybe we can end a little bit earlier than foreseen. That would be a positive note. I should like to thank all panelists again. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you in the name of the Ministry to the organizers, the Environmental Agency, Alexander Feldman. Please a show of hand at the last row. Thank you. And thank you to the interpreters as well. Thank you. I couldn't do your job. Thank you very much. Thank you.